History 1 video lecture for Chapter 18, which is the 18th century, obviously starting with the year 1700. We're now getting into the last third or so of the Baroque era. At this point, we started with our transition into the Baroque with Monteverdi and the development of opera, more chromaticism in the music used to heighten emotion. We go into Lully, the development of French opera, the shifting of tonalities, the final shifting of tonalities from modal-based to major and minor. In addition, Lully helped develop things like the French overture and a lot of conducting innovations. We've then gone into Italy in Chapter 17, where we've seen Alessandro Scarlatti, the continued development of opera, the emphasis on the da capo aria, ornamentation, and virtuosic singing. We've moved into Germany, where we've looked at probably the first of the really great organists, Dietrich Buxtehude. Now, we're going to start with the early 18th century in Italy and France. Now, you can't really talk about what was going on at this time without talking about the continued development of the middle class. As this middle class in society grows, you've now got this entirely new outlet of people who demand music. These people in the middle class, they're becoming more educated, and with the money they earn, they want to purchase music to perform at home, which means they need to purchase instruments. So that's an entirely new market, is people who are building instruments. Also, musicians could make a living teaching lessons to these members of the middle class and their children, very much so. And now we're starting to see a demand for performers. If you think back to the fact that the first public opera house opened in 1637, and in 1670 we started to see public concerts develop in England, which rapidly spread throughout the continent. Now there's another possibility of people staging performances of their music and members of this growing middle class purchasing tickets. Music making, professional music making, is now no longer limited just to the nobility. Changing styles. What we're going to see as we go on through the second part of the Baroque is a gradual transition that's into a period usually called the pre-classic or the Rococo, and we're going to see how the classical style begins to develop and overlap with the Baroque style. Changes in audiences and venues, well, we've talked about that. And then finally, debates between partisans, supporters of the old styles and the new styles. But that's something we've already talked about. It seems like every time a new style comes in, someone writes a book, a treatise, complaining about it. It happened to Monteverdi. Someone wrote a book complaining about this chromaticism he was using. It happened all the way back when they began to incorporate duple rhythms, imperfect rhythms, and someone wrote a book complaining about how awful these new duple rhythms were. No conversation about the mid to late Baroque can be complete without Antonio Vivaldi at the forefront. He was the best known composer in Italy. Interestingly enough, at the time he composed a lot of opera, but he is best remembered today, far and away best remembered today, for his instrumental music, specifically his violin music. He was a virtuoso performer on violin. He was a great teacher. As I said, he composed operas, cantatas. He composed sacred music for the Catholic Church as well. He was Italian. But he's mostly remembered for his violin music, the pinnacle of which is a set of 4 concertos titled The Four Seasons. You've probably heard of The Four Seasons. There's 4 violin concertos written by Vivaldi. His nickname, Il Prete Rosso, the red-headed priest. Well, when he was a younger man, he had red hair, and when he was a younger man, he actually took holy vows into the priesthood. Now, oddly enough, he didn't have great health, so he couldn't become a priest because he just wasn't physically strong enough. Priests did a lot of traveling in those days. So way back in the Middle Ages, it seemed that the priests in general were better fed and better housed than most of the population. Well, at this point in history, much of the population has actually seen better things as far as that goes, except in France. But we'll talk about that in the French Revolution during the classical era. So he couldn't take holy vows because he just wasn't healthy enough to support the lifestyle of a priest. Instead, it's a very famous picture. Obviously, can't see that he has red hair because he's wearing the powdered wigs that everybody wore during this time period. So he became a professional musician, a master teacher. His main gig was as a teacher at Pio Ospedale della Pieta, usually just referred to in Vivaldi's biography as La Pieta, which was an orphanage for girls only. It was an all-girls orphanage. Vivaldi taught music there. He also composed a lot of the music, and he directed the orchestra. Now, as conductor, this orchestra that he directed was an all-girls orchestra, and it was one of the most famous orchestras in all Italy. He was such a brilliant teacher that this all-girls orchestra at this orphanage was actually the rival of many professional groups. There's a painting of a dance festival happening, and up here, you can't really see, but this picture is in your text. Up in the balcony in the left part of the painting, you can actually see the orchestra from La Pieta, and if you look closely, you can see it's an all-girls orchestra. He was very, very prolific. Now, Vivaldi only lived to be 63 years old, but in that time, he composed around 500 concertos, the majority of them violin concertos, string concertos. He composed 49 operas. Now, only 21 of them survived. If you remember our conversation about Monteverdi, that Monteverdi composed, we know he composed 12 operas, but we only have music for 3 of them. In Vivaldi's case, we know because of records, letters people had written, invoices, hall rentals, things like that. We know that he composed 49 operas, but we only have music for 21 of them. He composed 38 cantatas for the church and around 60 sacred vocal pieces, his most famous of which was his Gloria, which is a multi-movement work for vocal soloist, chorus, and orchestra. The Vivaldi Gloria is one of the most performed sacred pieces of Baroque music today. But although Vivaldi wrote all of those operas and all that sacred music, with the exception of the Gloria, it's not performed as frequently, and his operas aren't really in the repertoire substantially today. He's best known for his instrumental music. He helped to popularize the 3-movement structure for a concerto. Essentially, Vivaldi's concertos, both his solo concertos, which were for a single instrument with an orchestra accompaniment, with continuo as part of that orchestra, and his concerto grosso, which were for a small group of solo instruments and orchestra, were in 3 movements. Vivaldi established this as the standard, and even to this day, the vast majority of concertos that are written are concerti, is the proper plural. Either one of them is acceptable plural, really. The vast majority of concerti that are written are in this 3-movement format. First movement is fast, the second movement is slow, and is either in the same key or in a closely related key to the first movement. And the final movement is fast, it's in the tonic key again, so the key of the opening movement. It's shorter, and it's usually very bouncy, very dance-like. It's very common in Vivaldi's music for the first movement to be in duple meter, say 4/4 time or cut time, and for the final movement to be in a rapid triple meter, 3/8 is very common, or 3/4, but taken very quickly, so it's in 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Almost a dance influence. The fast movements are usually in ritornello form. Now, ritornello form has aspects of what rondo form became. In a ritornello form, the ritornello, which is the name of the main theme, is always played by the orchestra, the accompanying ensemble, and it alternates with the soloist. The soloist is usually playing new music. So, if you think of the ritornello as being A, then you start with A, the ritornello being played by the orchestra, and then the soloist comes in with new music, that would be B. And then the orchestra plays the ritornello again. Usually, though, in ritornello form, except for the first and last time it happens, the ritornello is never played in its complete length. Just they will play fragments of it. So A, ritornello. B, soloist playing new material. A again, but just part of A, part of the ritornello being played by the orchestra. And then B, soloist, or C, soloist doing something different. Then A again, another fragment of the ritornello, then the soloist again, and then at the end of the movement, typically the orchestra plays the complete ritornello statement. You can see the similarities with the rondo form. Frequently the ritornello is made up of segments that can be broken up, and either, as I said, segments played by the orchestra in place of the complete ritornello, or sometimes the soloist might use those as a basis of a variation. Vivaldi published 9 collections of concerti. And when I say collections, he would publish a book, but the book wouldn't just be one concerto. It would be a whole set of concertos. His Opus 8, important word opus. Opus means work. It is from the Latin word for work, and usually the opus numbers are affixed to pieces of music in the order that they are published. So Opus 8 is the 8th thing that Vivaldi had published. Opus numbers did not come into standard use until after Beethoven. Before Beethoven, a lot of times, works weren't even cataloged. And then when they were cataloged later, they were given a number by the cataloger. And we'll get into that when we talk about Bach, because Bach's music does not have opus numbers. It has BWV numbers. Mozart's music does not have opus numbers. They have K numbers. We'll talk about what those mean when we get to those composers. So Opus 8, the 8th publication by Vivaldi, was a collection of violin concertos titled, translated to English, The Test of Harmony and Invention. Pretty cool title if you think about it. And his four most famous concertos, which I already mentioned, the Four Seasons, are part of his Opus 8. Obviously these concertos are titled Spring, Summer, Autumn, and Winter. You most assuredly have heard parts of these concertos. They're very famous. They're played all of the time. Each concerto has a little poem describing the season, and within the concerto there are actually titles for what's going on in the music. Like for spring, for example, first movement of spring, you have an episode which is titled Thunder and Lightning. You have an episode which is titled The Chirping of the Birds. You have an episode that is titled Running Stream, sitting along a stream where the water is running. This is something that people didn't usually do at the time. It really foreshadows a technique that develops in the Romantic era called program music. We'll get to that. The listening we're going to do in class, and we're going to follow the score, is from his Opus 3, that is his third publication, number 6. Again, his concertos were published in collections. His Opus 3 is a set of violin concertos. So the 6th violin concerto in this publication is Concerto in A minor, really one of his most famous concertos. It's a brilliant piece of music. Vivaldi's use of sequences, especially, does an amazing job of building tension through his movements. So we're gonna look at this piece in some detail. It's a terrific piece of music. So one last thing about Vivaldi before we move on to France. Vivaldi was very famous at the time, as I said, as a composer, as a teacher. His orchestra from La Pieta. Now, it's still Roman Catholic. Italy is still Roman Catholic, and women were not allowed to perform in church. But the church wanted his orchestra from La Pieta to perform, so they got around this by actually having them sit behind a screen. So no one, they could perform in church, but no one in the church saw them performing, so they could pretend, maybe, that there weren't any women performing in church. Vivaldi died. His music went out of style, as music tends to. He died and was completely obscure for 200 years. Over 200 years, very few people performed the music of Vivaldi. Really, for the first 100 years or so, no one performed it. Into the 20th century, Vivaldi's music was only really known by people who studied Baroque music. Like today, we have people who specialize in medieval music. Well, back in the middle part in the 20th century, there were people who specialized in Baroque music, but most of that music, with the exception of Bach, was not being performed, and some Handel, oratorios. Most of that music was not being performed on a regular basis, and Vivaldi's music was completely obscure. No one had heard of Vivaldi, except for a few scholars. What happened, and I think this is a really interesting story, was the invention of long-playing recordings. That's something that's before any of your time, but way back when they first invented the record, records were short. You could only fit 3 or 4 minutes of music on each side. So a Beethoven symphony, if they recorded a Beethoven symphony, it would literally be recorded on 8 or 10 records. And they would be edited in such a way that you'd play 4 minutes of the Beethoven, and then the next record would drop, and you'd play the next 4 minutes of the Beethoven, and then the next record would drop. Well, they invented something called a long playing record, 33 1/3 RPMs, big black disc, which we call LPs, long playing. Obviously, with the advent of the compact disc and then the MP3, LPs disappeared from the landscape, but they've made a comeback in the last 5 years, really. Some audiophiles, people who are very much into recording, have started releasing LPs again. They think there's something about the sound on a record that you can't get through digital files. When they invented the long playing record, with the ability to hold 20 to 30 minutes of music on each side of the record, and a good 40, 50 minutes of music total, they started looking for more music to record. And they discovered the music of Vivaldi, and so they started recording Vivaldi's music. It very quickly became popular, and since then, concertos like the Four Seasons have been played countless times. They're recorded hundreds and hundreds of times. They're performed all over the world on a regular basis. So Vivaldi's music disappeared for a couple hundred years, and it's really just within the last 60 years that it's become so popular again, but it really is. So while Vivaldi was doing this stuff in Italy, in France, there was a lot of interesting music going on as well. Most of it centered in Paris. That's where all the new things were happening in France. We're going to start with talking about Francois Couperin. Now, Couperin is a very important composer at his time. He served as an organist for the king of France. He gave keyboard lessons, harpsichord lessons, to the wealthy and members of the nobility in France, and he wrote music, which he published himself. Couperin is such an important figure in French music that 200 years after his death, the great French composer Maurice Ravel, Ravel's most famous probably for his orchestra piece Bolero, 200 years after Couperin's death, Ravel wrote a brilliant piece titled At the Tomb of Couperin, in tribute to Francois Couperin. That's how important he was thought to be by French musicians. He liked to take some influences from Italy and blend those into French music. Remember, we've gone from this purely international style we had by the end of the Renaissance to separated out national styles again. Well, Couperin didn't see anything wrong with absorbing influences from different countries. So he absorbed some Italian influences and blended those into what was going on in France. Portrait of Couperin. In almost every portrait you ever see from the Renaissance, and most definitely from the Baroque, of a musician, they're always holding a piece of music. If you look in your book, this particular portrait, figure 8, chapter 18, figure 6 is in your book, and you can see Couperin's holding a piece of music. The most famous portrait of Bach ever done is of Bach holding a piece of music. Couperin, most famous compositions most likely were his suites. His suites were written for keyboard instrument. He wrote, I believe, I want to say 25 suites, although I'll have to double check that number. And each suite is very similar to the French suites that were happening at the time, a collection of short dance-inspired movements in binary form. However, the style is a little more modern than the suites that we've listened to this point. We will listen to excerpts from these Couperin suites. Specifically, I think we're going to listen to these two movements that the book emphasizes, the Dreamer and the Victorious Muse. The Dreamer is kind of inspired by French Overture. Victorious Muse is in fast triple meter, kind of like a gigue. These are from his 25th suite, which was published in 1730, just 3 years before his death. Now, another reason why Couperin is very important is, I've mentioned this before. Throughout history, especially after the advent of the printing press, of course, musicians would write books about how to play music, sometimes specifically geared to how to play a certain instrument. A lot of what we know today about the way Baroque music was performed, the kinds of ornaments that they used, the kinds of rhythmic style that they used, even ideas about tempos and things like that, come from these treatises, these books that were written, including one by Couperin, which translates as The Art of Playing the Harpsichord, published in 1716, tells us a lot about the way French performers were performing in the middle to later Baroque. So all of these people out there that specialize in period instrument performance, there are a couple groups in Philadelphia. Vox Amadeus is a period instrument performance group up in Philadelphia. A lot of what they've studied over the years so that they know how to perform Baroque music properly is from reading books like Couperin's Art of Playing the Harpsichord. There's another book by Joseph Joaquin Quantz, J.J. Quantz, titled On Playing the Flute. It's an instruction book about how to learn to play the flute, but a lot of what we know about how to properly stylize Baroque music comes from books like Quantz's book and Couperin's book. Couperin leads us to Jean-Philippe Rameau. Rameau, very, very important composer. He is recognized, in his day he was recognized as a music theorist, someone who wrote about music theory, and today that's probably where his greatest fame comes from. In France, he did become famous also as a composer in his 1950s. Interestingly enough, he, like many composers, was criticized by some of the older composers initially for being too radical, too different, wanting to change everything and do things that they just didn't understand. If you look back through history, a lot of the most famous composers through history, we talked about this with Monteverdi. He was criticized for being too radical. Rameau was criticized for being too radical. Beethoven was criticized for being too radical. Stravinsky was criticized. Berlioz. Not all famous composers were there, but no one ever criticized Bach for being too radical. Bach was actually quite mainstream. He just did it better than anyone else. Very famous picture of Rameau. Hey, look, here's a portrait of Rameau, and here's a piece of music sitting next to him. He's holding a violin. Maybe it's the way the portraitist knew, would make sure everyone knew what the person did for a living. Okay, in 1722, Rameau wrote a book, Treatise on Harmony. It is one of the most influential music theory books ever written. This is written after, if you remember, Johann Fuchs's Steps to Parnassus. This was written after that. It's very, very important work, and he based a lot of his theoretical ideas on his study of acoustics, principles of acoustics. Now, to think, that takes us all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and this idea of an octave as a ratio of 2 to 1, and a perfect fifth is a ratio of 4 to 3, and a perfect fourth is a ratio of 5 to 4. Those mathematical ratios gave us pure intervals. Well, Rameau kind of believes some of the same stuff. A lot of what you have to study in music theory comes out of Rameau's book. This idea of defining each chord by the root of the chord, and then identifying inversions. So Rameau's book kind of codified this idea that if you're looking at a chord that's, say, spelled A, C sharp, E, then you're going to identify that chord as an A chord, identified by the root of the chord. However, if the chord is spelled C sharp, A, E, you're still going to identify it by the root, the A in this case, but you're going to identify it as being an inversion, obviously in this case first inversion. He also wrote about the idea that dissonance is what moves music forward. Basically, if you think, there's an old theory about writing drama, you know, be it for a play or a book, a novel, or a movie soundtrack. And what it's all about is basically conflict. Something has to start the action moving. If there is no conflict, well, then nothing really happens. So conflict propels the movie, propels the novel forward until eventually you get a resolution. Sometimes the resolution is predictable, sometimes it's quite surprising. Rameau believed the same basic idea in music, that music is propelled by dissonance and rests at consonances. And if you think about it, even a very simple chord progression usually starts on 1, and then we move to 4, which is not a dissonance, but it's dissonant relative to the tonic because it wants to move. 4 wants to move usually to our ears, to Western ears, to 5. And you throw a 7th on there, you get even more dissonance, which wants to propel us forward again to a resting place, in this case, back to the tonic in that very basic chord progression. Phrases have resting points, and entire pieces have resting points. Rameau started to identify these chords within the key structure with the terms like tonic, subdominant, dominant, mediant, submediant. He decided that the tonic, dominant, and subdominant were the 3 pillars, the 3 fundamental parts of a chord progression within a tonal structure. Now remember, by Rameau's time, the modal system is gone. Everyone is writing entirely in major and minor tonalities now. So that sets up the possibility of this idea of harmony being structured. He also believed that pieces could change keys within the piece, but ultimately each piece had a tonic key, and the motion is propelled by moving away from this tonic key and eventually resolving back to this tonic key. He also identified the strongest chord progression at this time as being the dominant 7 resolving back to the tonic. These are ideas that are still true today, but Rameau's the first person to really write them all down. So basically you can blame Jean-Philippe Rameau for music theory 3 and 4. You can either credit him for them or blame him for them, depending on your attitude towards learning music theory. He was also a composer. Best remembered as a theorist, but he was also a popular composer, and best known probably for his operas. He also wrote some trio sonatas, he wrote keyboard music, but he's best remembered today for his opera. These 4 probably his most famous. You can see some of this, Castor and Pollux, that's Roman. Hippolyte and Arce, that's also, I think that's Greek. So he's still using a lot of the same topics, although not all of them. If you've ever heard of Zoroastrianism, it's a religion. And this opera is based on a story of Zoroaster. Paid tribute to in a very important philosophical book that was written 100 years later, also Sprach Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. Zarathustra is the Germanic spelling. Given the opportunity in class, we will listen to a bit of a Rameau opera. Okay, so mid-Baroque, mid to late Baroque, shifting now into the 1700s. In Italy, focuses around the music of Vivaldi. He wasn't the only person writing music, but he's the most important of the composers in Italy at that time. And in France, centering around the music of Couperin and Jean-Philippe Rameau, both his theoretical writings and his operas. So in class, there will of course be an online quiz that you'll have to take that will be due at the start of class. And in class, we will take an in-depth look at the Vivaldi Concerto and a Rameau opera, potentially, as well as a Couperin suite.